Hello, I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and thank you for joining me. I am going to be looking in Romans 8:15 today, but we're going back in this context because he is using three of these conjunctions, which I yesterday accidentally, I think on one of the times I called this gar an inferential particle. It's an inferential conjunction. I caught myself after the fact. But he's drawing a logical conclusion. He's drawing an inference from what he said in the context here that we do not have an obligation to live according to the flesh anymore. We've been freed from that. And he's drawn a couple conclusions along the way. But yesterday we saw in verse 14, for as many as are being led by the Spirit of God, they are sons of God. So he's talking about you in your conduct are actually living as a son of God when you're following the Spirit's lead. And when you're following the Spirit's lead, you are experiencing freedom from your sin nature, and which is exactly what Paul's goal has been in this context. He's been addressing the issue or the problem of the sin nature, and in particular, addressing God's provision for you and I to experience freedom from that. And we experience it when we follow the Spirit's lead because he leads us to our position in Christ, to who we are in Christ, where God says, we died with Christ as sin nature, but we are now living to God. And we follow that lead there. And that brings us then to verse 15. And this is going to be directly related to our being sons of God. And he says in verse 15, for you have not received a spirit of slavery again unto fear. And he's using a small s here for spirit because he's referring to some other spirit that would produce fear in the individual, in contrast to, he says, but you have received the spirit of adoption or placement as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. Now, the thing I would like to focus on primarily at this moment is the idea of fear. But just to go back and review this idea of adoption, this is not what we think of as adoption, where a person goes and takes a child that is not biologically theirs and legally makes them their child. Now, that word was used that way in the Roman world, but it also was used of the other ritual of taking your own child and graduating them in their status within the family. And this is clearly demonstrated in Galatians 4, where he tells us that you could be a child in the family, be the heir of everything, but as long as you were that child that couldn't articulate. And that doesn't just mean like a little child that just is ba, ba, ba. It's a child up to the age of, shall we say, adulthood or sonship, in which you're not going to trust them to conduct business on behalf of the family. So this is this idea of adoption, placing us as sons, where we actually are given some real responsibility in the family. Yeah, younger children, do they have responsibilities? Yeah, help clean the house, help cook, help with the dishes. This is talking about responsibility in terms of really conducting business within the family. And that's a very important opportunity, privilege, we might even say. Now he says that's the spirit that we've received. The Spirit has produced this placement as sons, where we've been moved and we have this status where we can represent the family well. But he says in the first part of it that there was this spirit of slavery to fall back into fear. Now that slavery was slavery for the Jews when they were under the law. And it was a slavery of fear. Fear was a key motivation for people living the law. And it still is a motivation for lots of Christians today. Now, I don't want to skew the evidence on fear. There are a lot of references in the letters to the churches, to us as New Testament believers, that speak about fear. But I think we need to make sure we understand that fear properly. And I think one example, we actually have two passages that I think maybe illustrate this well for us. Ephesians 5:33, and this is in the context, let me pull up a parallel so you can see this in English, pardon me. It says, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she, now notice how the ESV, they say, respects her husband. But it's the verb fear. Now, what does it mean by fear? Now, I say this to the men in our church. I hope that doesn't mean that your wife fears you, because if she gets out of line, that you're going to smack her. That is completely uncalled for. That is not the way that you relate to your spouse. And you do not intimidate her. You do not put her under fear in that respect. I believe that probably as they're translating it, this idea of respect is that let the woman really show that she holds her husband in this regard. That's what he needs. In fact, it's not that the husband doesn't need love from the wife, or that the husband shouldn't show respect for his wife, but I think he's focusing on the two things that they each especially need in this relationship. The husband really needs to demonstrate love for his wife. I think it's the weakness that we have. We're more likely, it's easier just to try to make sure you put the wife in her proper place, if you understand the way people think. No, you need to demonstrate love. And likewise, the wife, it's not so much that she just needs to dote over her husband in love, but she needs to actually show him some real respect and treat him with respect in that way. And I believe that illustrates, if she's fearing that he's going to hit her, there's a real serious problem going on in that marriage, both on her part, but mostly on his part, if that's the way that things are being conducted, and that would be inappropriate. So it's a good place to demonstrate that I think we're talking about that there can be fear at a different level, a different kind or quality of fear. There's another one here that maybe moves a little bit more in the way that we think of fear, and this is in Hebrews 4:1. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest, and that's not talking about entering heaven, that's talking about a rest down here, promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to come short of it. In other words, you could live down here and you might miss out on enjoying that rest. You might spend the rest of your life struggling to be good enough as a Christian. We're not talking about unsaved people. We're talking about Christians struggling, thinking that they need to be good enough to approach God. And they might miss out. And he says, you ought to fear that. You ought to fear that. Because you need to recognize Christ is enough. He is your access to God. And it's never going to be that you are good enough in that way. It's that you're good enough in Christ. Now with that then, I want to go over to 1 John 4 and kind of pull this idea of fear together with this statement in verse 17, by this love is perfected or matured, I think would be a better way for us to understand this, so that we may have confidence in the day of judgment, because just as Jesus is, so also are we in this world. That is, he's out of this world, according to John 17, and so God counts us also to be, in one sense or another, in him, and not really part of the world. Verse 18, there is no fear in love, but perfect or mature mature love drives or throws fear out, casts fear out, because fear has to do with punishment. And the one who fears punishment has not been matured in love. So really, verse 18 here in 1 John 4:18 is telling us that fear is a symptom of immaturity. And see, if we go back over there to Romans where we started, what did he say we are? He said back here we're sons, and we've received the spirit of placement as sons, so that it's not that we should be acting in fear. We should be acting as those who are mature. And if we're mature, then we don't live in fear. We're not living back under a law system like that. And yet, as I said this at the intro, a lot of us as Christians slip back into this fear mentality in the Christian life. That we're like, I need to be good and I need to do these certain things because I need to stay in good with God because I don't want to get in trouble with God. And that usually is a demonstration of immaturity on our part when we think like that. our motivation ought to be, this is who God says I am in Christ. My life really should match that because God has been so gracious and kind to me. That's a completely different motivation than saying, I need to stay in good with God and I need to avoid getting in trouble with God. And in that regard, then, when we're able to live without fear, because we are experiencing this freedom that the Spirit produces, we cry out to God, Abba, Father. And I've said this before, there is a disagreement into exactly why he says Abba, Father, because Abba is simply the Aramaic version of the Hebrew word Father. The Greek word Father is pater, but the Hebrew word Father is Ab, and the Aramaic is Abba. But Abba also had come, by the time the New Testament is written, had come to be the way a child referred to their daddy. Now, my girls call me Dad now. But when they were very little, I remember one of the first words that my oldest daughter said. I would leave for class in the morning, and she'd be sitting on the sofa with her mom, and she would say, Dada. Kind of irked her mom that she didn't say Mama first. She said Dada, but I think it was because I was always the one coming and going at that stage of her life. And she called me Dada, and later Daddy. And that's more akin to what Paul's trying to say with Abba. He's talking about a term of endearment. He's talking about a warm relationship, not a cowering, fearful relationship here, where we're fearing that God is going to smack us because we've gotten out of line. But actually this spirit of placement as sons by which we're able to cry and recognize our Father as the one who really loves and cares for us, which Paul will eventually come back to that issue as we get towards the end of this chapter. Boy, if you stop and think about the privilege of recognizing God as your daddy father, your Abba Father, wow, that's a thing that'll encourage you when you're operating without fear in this way to have a good day in the Lord. Thank you again for joining me.